For friends, Ethan, Mark, Lucas, and Daniel decided to go on a weekend camping trip deep in the mountains of northern Colorado. They had been planning the trip for weeks, excited to escape the noise of the city and spend time in the wilderness. The forest they chose was remote, surrounded by tall pine trees and a quiet lake nearby. By late afternoon, they arrived at the campsite, unloaded their gear, and began setting up their tents. The air was cool, and the forest smelled of damp wood and earth. Birds chirped overhead, and the wind rustled through the leaves. Everything felt peaceful and normal. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, they started a small campfire and cooked dinner. The flames crackled softly while they laughed and shared stories. None of them knew that this calm evening would soon turn into one of the most terrifying nights of their lives. The forest slowly grew darker, and the sounds around them began to change in ways none of them noticed at first. As night fell, the forest became unusually quiet. The chirping insects suddenly stopped, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence. Mark was the first to notice it. He looked around the dark trees surrounding their campsite and said it felt strange that the woods had gone completely silent.
Perfect, right?
Ethan laughed it off, saying animals probably just moved deeper into the forest. Still, something about the silence felt wrong.
Maybe too quiet.
The only sound left was the crackling fire and the occasional wind brushing against the tall trees. Daniel shined his flashlight toward the tree line but saw nothing except endless shadows stretching between the trunks. Lucas joked that maybe something in the woods was watching them. Everyone laughed nervously, but the joke didn't feel funny for long. A few minutes later they heard something in the distance. It sounded like slow footsteps moving through the leaves. At first they assumed it was a deer or raccoon wandering nearby, but the footsteps sounded heavier than any animal they had heard before. The footsteps stopped suddenly just outside the faint glow of the campfire. The four friends sat still, staring into the darkness. Beyond the trees, Daniel grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the direction of the sound. The beam of light cut through the darkness but revealed nothing moving between the trees. For a moment they all relaxed, assuming whatever it was had walked away. But then Lucas whispered something that made everyone's stomach drop. He said the footsteps hadn't been walking away, they had been circling around their campsite. Ethan quickly stood up and walked a few steps toward the trees, trying to see better. The forest beyond the firelight looked endless and black. Suddenly, another step crunched loudly behind him. Ethan froze instantly. The sound had come from a completely different direction than before. It was clear now that something was moving around them. In the darkness, staying just far enough away to remain hidden. Trying to stay calm, Mark suggested they add more wood to the fire to brighten the campsite. The flames grew larger, pushing the shadows further back. For a moment, the forest seemed empty again. But Daniel suddenly noticed something strange near the edge of the trees. He pointed his flashlight and saw a shape quickly move behind a trunk. It was too tall to be a deer, and it didn't move like any animal they recognized. Lucas stood up beside him, trying to see it too, but whatever it was had already disappeared. Cold chill passed through the group. Ethan insisted it was probably another camper walking through the woods. Still no one called out and no voice answered them. The woods remained silent. After several minutes with no more movement, they slowly sat back down around the fire, trying to convince themselves nothing unusual had happened. About an hour later, the fire had burned low, and exhaustion started to set in. The friends decided it was time to sleep. They climbed into their tents, leaving a small lantern glowing outside the entrance. The forest remained silent as they settled into their sleeping bags. For a while, everything seemed normal again. Then Daniel heard something outside his tent. It was the faint sound of someone walking slowly across the campsite. At first he assumed one of his friends had stepped outside, but the footsteps sounded careful, almost like someone trying not to be heard. The crunch of leaves stopped directly beside his tent. Daniel held his breath, listening closely. He could hear slow breathing just outside the thin fabric wall. Daniel whispered to the others, asking if anyone was outside, but no one answered. Instead, Ethan's voice came from the next tent, sounding just as confused. He said he thought Daniel was the one walking around. The realization sent a wave of fear through the group. If none of them were outside, then someone else was standing in their campsite. The breathing sound grew louder. Daniel slowly reached for his flashlight, his hands shaking. Before he could turn it on, something brushed against the side of the tent. The fabric bent inward slightly, as if someone had pressed a hand against it. No one moved. The forest was completely silent again. Suddenly the footsteps began moving again, slowly circling the tents. The friends could hear leaves crunching and small twigs snapping. Under heavy weight, Lucas whispered that maybe they should run to the car, but Ethan said they had no idea where the person, or whatever it was standing. Minutes passed like hours. Then the footsteps stopped again. This time they stopped directly between tents. The breathing sound returned, deeper and slower than before. Daniel felt the ground vibrate slightly, as if something heavy had shifted its weight nearby. Without warning, a loud thud struck the ground beside the tents. The friends all jumped in terror. It sounded like something had dropped a large object onto the dirt. Ethan finally gathered the courage to unzip his tent slowly and shine his flashlight outside. A beam scanned across the empty campsite. For a moment, nothing appeared unusual. But then the light revealed something lying in the center of their campfire circle. It was a large pile of stones arranged in a strange pattern. None of the stones had been there before. Confused and terrified, the group stepped out of their tents together. The forest around them felt darker than before, almost suffocating. Daniel looked down at the stones and noticed something disturbing. They were arranged in the shape of a large circle, and inside the circle were fresh footprints. The footprints were enormous, far larger than any of theirs. The prints led from the forest straight into the campsite, but none of them led back out. At that moment, Lucas slowly raised his flashlight toward the trees. Standing just beyond the edge of the light was a tall, shadowy figure, watching them silently. Its shape was human-like but far too tall and thin to be normal. The moment the light touched it, the figure stepped backward into the darkness and disappeared completely. None of them spoke. They quickly packed their gear and left the campsite before sunrise, driving for hours without stopping. To this day, none of them can explain what they saw in those woods. But one thing still haunts them all: the footprints that led into the campsite and never came back out.